Imagine standing before a colossal wound carved into the heart of Rome, a half-circle of broken arches, its jagged edge slicing through the skyline like a memory refusing to die. Tourists shuffle across its ancient stones now, holding selfie sticks where emperors once stood. But if you listen closely, the air still hums with a different sound of cheers, of screams, of history's cruel heartbeat. Tonight, we're not just looking at what remains of the Colosseum. We're listening to what it lost. This isn't just another ruin. It's a ghost that built an empire, bled for it, and then was devoured by the city it once defined. When the Flavian Amphitheater opened in 80 CE, it wasn't the hollow skeleton we see today. It was a statement written in concrete and ego, a thunderclap from the emperors to the world. Rome will last forever. Marble gleamed like sunlight frozen in stone. Statues lined the corridors. Its 80 entrances promised that every Roman from senator to slave had a place in this temple of spectacle. And for a time, that illusion held. The Colosseum wasn't just architecture. It was propaganda made visible. It was how emperors bought loyalty with bread and blood, disguising tyranny beneath the roar of a crowd. Imagine the opening festival, 100 days of relentless games. Gladiators fought until the sand turned black. Wild beasts imported from Africa and Asia were slaughtered for applause. In one mad display of engineering, the arena was even flooded for mock naval battles. Rome called it entertainment, but it was closer to ritualized madness, a psychological mirror that reflected who they were, conquerors drunk on their own power. We look back now and shudder, but part of the genius of the Colosseum was that it made cruelty look divine. The audience believed they were witnessing the gods at play while men died for amusement. Yet beyond the grandeur, there's a strange kind of brilliance in how it was built. The Romans didn't just stack stone. They invented the modern stadium. Concrete arches layered with mathematical precision. Corridors wide enough to move 50,000 people in minutes. Elevators powered by slaves that lifted lions and warriors through trapdoors. It was the logistics of death perfected. Even today, architects study the structure and marvel at its efficiency. Rome, for all its barbarity, understood spectacle better than any civilization before or since. But here's the part most people overlook. The Colosseum was never meant to last forever. It was meant to outlast its builders, yes, but not time itself. Every stone was propaganda. Every spectacle was an attempt to distract from decay. Because even as the Colosseum opened, cracks had already begun to appear in the empire's soul. It was built on forced labor, funded by plunder, and sustained by distraction. That's the paradox of Rome. The same civilization that invented aqueducts also invented mass murder as sport. Their genius and their brutality were one and the same. And perhaps that's why the Colosseum still captivates us. It embodies a contradiction that we can't quite turn away from. The structure itself was meant to be eternal, but eternity has a cruel sense of humor. Earthquakes would one day split it open. Looters would strip it bare. Popes would carve its bones into cathedrals. The Colosseum would not be toppled by an invading army, but slowly dismantled by the very city that once worshipped it. And that's where our story begins, not with its creation, but with its unmaking. The Colosseum didn't die in a single night. It faded out like a fire left untended. One moment it was the crown of the empire, and the next, a relic that even its builders pretended not to see. By the 5th century, the games that once defined Roman identity had lost their audience. The empire was running out of money, running out of slaves, running out of the illusion that violence could hold the world together. And when you remove the spectacle, what remains? A shell, a monument without meaning. The last recorded gladiator fight took place in 404 CE, a final performance where blood met dust under the watch of a weary empire. By then, Rome's heart was already elsewhere, besieged by barbarians, poisoned by corruption, and spiritually shifting toward a new power rising in the shadows: Christianity. For centuries, the Colosseum had been a temple to death. Now, it stood condemned by a faith that preached mercy and salvation. The same emperors who once ruled through fear were replaced by bishops who ruled through faith. To them, the amphitheater wasn't just obsolete, it was obscene. Picture that transformation. A building once filled with 50,000, screaming Romans now echoing with silence. No lions, no cheers, no trumpets, just the sound of wind crawling through empty corridors. The same walls that had seen emperors raise their thumbs in judgment now stood as cold stone, reminders of a past too violent to celebrate. The irony is impossible to ignore. Rome, the eternal city, was falling apart piece by piece, and its greatest symbol had become a haunted shell. Even the stones seemed to mourn. Yet for all its decay, the Colosseum survived Rome's collapse. When Visigoths stormed the city in 410, they didn't destroy it. They didn't have to. The amphitheater wasn't a threat anymore. It was a fossil. As emperors were assassinated and kingdoms rose from the ashes, the Colosseum remained, its marble turning gray with neglect. Rome had stopped cheering, but it hadn't stopped existing. The people simply moved on, building their lives around the ruin like it was an inconvenient monument from a story they no longer wanted to tell. The fall of the games revealed something deeper about Rome itself. The empire had been built on spectacle bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal called it. But once the bread ran out and the circuses closed, the mask fell away. Rome wasn't a divine order. It was a system of distraction. And when the people lost their distractions, they faced a truth too painful to bear, that they had traded humanity for entertainment. The Colosseum, once the stage of empire, became the stage of consequence. Its silence was the sound of Rome realizing what it had become. There's a quiet poetry in how ruins age. They don't just crumble, they adapt. They absorb meaning, even as they lose function. The Colosseum was no longer an engine of slaughter, but it was still a presence, still watching. In the centuries that followed, its purpose shifted again and again, from theater to quarry, from fortress to shrine. Each new generation redefined it to fit their needs. The arena that once divided Romans by class would one day unite them in superstition, survival, and eventually, tourism. But before all that, before popes and pilgrims, before looters and earthquakes, there came a long, slow forgetting. The city that had built its identity around glory learned how to live with loss. And it started here, in the shadow of an empty stadium. By the time the 9th century rolled around, the Colosseum was already fading into legend. Rome had shrunk to a fraction of its former size, its marble streets now dirt paths, its temples repurposed as churches, its empire long gone. The people who still lived among the ruins didn't see themselves as heirs to Caesar. They were survivors, scavengers in a city haunted by ghosts. The amphitheater still loomed over them, massive and cracked, a half-forgotten god watching over a world that no longer prayed to it. And then the earth itself reminded Rome that nothing human lasts forever. In 847 CE, the first great earthquake struck. The southern side of the Colosseum, its proud arc of arches that had once shimmered in sunlight, gave way. Marble split, stone thundered down, and dust filled the air. For the first time, the structure that had survived centuries of blood, politics, and neglect began to collapse under the weight of nature. No invading army could bring it down, but the ground beneath it could. The damage was catastrophic, but also poetic. The Colosseum, which had once been a weapon of propaganda built to project Roman control over the natural and human world, was suddenly reminded that even emperors can't outbuild a planet. The southern half, built on softer, less stable soil, crumbled first. Engineers centuries earlier had done their best, laying deep foundations and binding stone with iron clamps, but fault lines don't care about ambition. The quake didn't destroy the amphitheater completely. It simply cut it in half, as if the earth had taken a knife to history and said, "You've had enough." And how did Rome respond? Not with reverence, not with preservation, with practicality. The fallen stones were everywhere. Thousands of blocks of perfectly cut travertine scattered like treasure across the city. To the people of medieval Rome, this wasn't a disaster. It was a gift. Why quarry fresh stone when the finest material in the empire had just landed at your feet? Builders, masons, even priests began carting it away. Within months, chunks of the Colosseum were showing up in churches, walls, and new homes. Rome had invented a new industry, urban recycling. The Colosseum didn't fall overnight. It was dismantled in slow motion. Each tremor loosened more stone. Each century gave Rome new reasons to keep taking. By the 11th century, the amphitheater was a skeleton of itself, still massive, still iconic, but hollowed out. Every time the ground shook, more history fell into the hands of those too practical to mourn it. To them, the amphitheater wasn't a symbol of empire or glory. It was free building material. It's hard to blame them. The Middle Ages weren't kind. People were starving, politics were chaos, and faith was the only currency that mattered. Preserving pagan monuments wasn't a priority when you were trying to survive. Then came 1349, another quake. Bigger, meaner, the kind that doesn't just move stone. It rewrites a city. The Colosseum's southern flank, already cracked and limping, collapsed in a storm of dust and thunder. Arches folded like paper. The amphitheater that had once embodied Roman perfection now looked like a broken jaw. One side proud and intact, the other mangled beyond repair. And that, more than any war or vandal, was the moment the Colosseum as we know it was born. Half whole, half wounded. The ruin became its identity. Medieval Rome didn't see tragedy in this. It saw opportunity. Families like the Frangipani and Annibaldi moved in, fortifying parts of the ruin as personal castles. Popes began mining it for marble to build their cathedrals. Even the Vatican's most sacred walls glitter with the blood of the Colosseum stones. The amphitheater that once stood for Rome's dominance now lay dismembered across the eternal city, piece by piece reborn as basilicas and fountains. And so, the answer to what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum isn't found in one moment of collapse, but in centuries of slow cannibalization. The city didn't just lose it. It consumed it. The irony runs deep. A structure that once symbolized imperial unity ended up scattered into the very churches and palaces that defined Rome's rebirth. The Colosseum was dying, but it was also transforming, its pieces reassembled into the architecture of faith. The arena of blood had become the foundation of salvation. Maybe that's the only way Rome could reconcile with its past, by swallowing it whole and pretending it was reborn. If you walked through Rome in the 12th century, you wouldn't have recognized the Colosseum as a monument at all. The tourists weren't here yet. The postcards didn't exist. The southern half lay in ruin, its bones stripped bare, while the northern half stood defiantly, like an old soldier too proud to fall. But the people who lived in its shadow didn't see a relic, they saw opportunity. Rome wasn't a city of emperors anymore. It was a city of survivors. Noble families, eager to prove their power in a fractured world, began to carve up what was left of the empire's skeleton. The Colosseum was no longer a stadium, it was prime medieval real estate. The Frangipani family moved in first, claiming part of the Colosseum as their fortress. They bricked up arches, added towers, and turned the arena into a private castle, complete with guards and banners. Imagine that. Where lions once roared, noblemen now held banquets. Where gladiators once fought to the death, servants scurried to pour wine. The same arches that once echoed with the roar of crowds now heard laughter, plotting, and whispered conspiracies. Rome's symbol of public power had become a stage for private ambition. And yet there was a certain dark poetry to it. The Colosseum had always been about dominance, only the actors had changed. But the nobility didn't stop at squatting. They started carving. When the Frangipani's rivals, the Annibaldi clan, took control of another section, the Colosseum became a medieval duplex of power, a fortress divided by family feuds. What had once united an empire now separated bloodlines. The irony is painful and perfect. The building that had hosted battles for entertainment now hosted them for survival. Its stones had been designed to hold up the weight of empires, but now they held the fragile egos of men. Meanwhile, outside its crumbling walls, the city continued to mine its carcass. Every arch, every marble panel, every iron clamp was a potential payday. The church wasn't innocent either. Popes who condemned pagan excess were just as quick to carve up its remains for their basilicas. St. Peter's Basilica, perhaps the holiest structure in Christendom, owes part of its skin to the Colosseum. It's the ultimate irony. A monument to divine mercy built with stones soaked in blood. Every pilgrim who knelt at its altar unknowingly touched the bones of Rome's most infamous slaughterhouse. Faith and empire intertwined, not by design, but by convenience. As for the iron that once bound the Colosseum's great blocks together, it became one of the most valuable resources in the city. Medieval blacksmiths, desperate for metal, chipped away at the amphitheater's walls to pry out the clamps. Each stolen piece weakened the structure further, leaving behind the pockmarked scars that still tattoo its surface today. 1,000 years of engineering brilliance undone by hammers and greed. But it wasn't malice, it was survival. The Middle Ages weren't a time for preservation. They were a time for making do. The Colosseum became a hardware store, a quarry, and a castle all at once, a monument transformed by human need. And this is the strange truth about ruins. They're not destroyed in a single act of violence. They're eroded by practicality. The Colosseum's missing half didn't vanish. It was borrowed, repurposed, absorbed into Rome's new identity. The marble that once lined the emperor's podium now gleamed in papal palaces. The arches that once framed gladiators now framed shop windows. History wasn't lost, it was recycled. Rome didn't forget the Colosseum. It simply reimagined it. In some ways, That transformation makes it more human. Every civilization inherits its ruins, and every generation decides what to do with them. The Romans of the Middle Ages weren't villains for tearing it apart. They were rewriting it into the fabric of their own lives. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Colosseum. Not endurance, but adaptability. It survived not because it stayed the same, but because it kept finding new roles to play in a city that refused to die. By the time the Renaissance dawned, the Colosseum wasn't an amphitheater, a fortress, or even a ruin. It was a monument in transition, half forgotten and half immortal, standing as a mirror to the people who lived around it. Some saw beauty. Others saw profit. A few saw ghosts. All saw themselves reflected in its broken arches. The arena that once symbolized Rome's control over the world had become the symbol of Rome's surrender to time. By the late Middle Ages, the Colosseum had lost even the dignity of ruin. The emperors were long dead. The noble families had moved their feuds elsewhere, and what remained of the amphitheater was swallowed by everyday life. The grand arena that once hosted gladiators now hosted gossip. Its corridors, once filled with lions and blood, echoed with the chatter of merchants, the hammering of blacksmiths, and the lowing of animals. The Colosseum had become a city within a city, a medieval shopping mall built from the bones of empire. The transformation was gradual, but inevitable. Rome's population had dwindled. People needed shelter and space to survive. The Colosseum offered both. Its massive arches became ready-made storefronts. Bakers lit their ovens where slaves once stood. Butchers hung their meats beneath frescoed ceilings that had witnessed death for sport. Blacksmiths set up their forges beside the same tunnels where gladiators once waited for the gates to rise. You could buy bread, fix a shoe, and hear mass all within the same ruin. Rome had turned its greatest monument into a marketplace of ghosts. And in the strangest twist of all, people began to live there. Entire families moved into the Colosseum's lower levels, transforming its ancient arches into apartments. Imagine waking up every morning beneath the same stone that once held emperors' thrones, feeding goats in the same arena where men once fought to the death. The Colosseum wasn't a symbol of glory anymore. It was a neighborhood. Smoke curled from makeshift chimneys. Children played among collapsed columns. Laundry lines hung where royal banners once waved. To us, that sounds tragic. To them, it was simply practical. History doesn't pay the rent. Travelers who came to Rome during this era were stunned. They expected to find the mighty amphitheater of legend, and instead discovered a strange hybrid of ruin and life-part cathedral, part slum, part market. Some described it as eerie, others as absurd. A 12th century pilgrim wrote that the Colosseum looked like a broken crown worn by peasants. Yet even in its disfigurement, there was beauty. The ruin had become democratic. Once reserved for emperors and elites, it now belonged to everyone. The poor, the merchants, the wanderers, the goats. In its decay, it had finally become Rome's truest public space. The city didn't see it as blasphemy. The Romans of that age didn't romanticize ruins the way we do. To them, old buildings were resources, not relics. If a structure stood, it had purpose. If it crumbled, you reused it. The Colosseum had simply adapted to its time. It had been a symbol of power, then a fortress of fear, and now it was something quieter, a living monument that fed, housed, and employed those it once entertained. The empire's monument had become the people's shelter. But the deeper irony was just beneath the dust. Every cobbler's stall, every butcher's counter, every humble home carried traces of its brutal past. The sand beneath the market still hid bones. The walls still bore pockmarks where iron clamps were ripped out. Some said at night you could hear whispers, the faint ring of steel, the cry of beasts. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was memory. Either way, the Colosseum was alive in a new way, a ruin that refused to be silent. And just when you thought its story couldn't twist further, the Colosseum became a pasture. Goats and sheep grazed on grass that had overtaken the arena floor. The ground that once soaked in human blood now bloomed with weeds, turning the amphitheater into a meadow of quiet defiance. To a passing shepherd, it wasn't the fall of civilization. It was free grazing land. To travelers, though, it was surreal. Imagine walking into the heart of ancient Rome, expecting triumphal arches and finding livestock munching on eternity. A ruin once built for death now nurtured life. That's the paradox that makes it immortal. This phase of the Colosseum's life, part market, part home, part barn, says more about humanity than any victory parade ever could. We take what we inherit, and we reshape it until it serves us. The Romans of the Middle Ages weren't destroying history. They were living inside it. Every hammer strike, every goat's bleat, every loaf sold under its arches was proof that the Colosseum still had purpose. Maybe not the kind its builders intended, but maybe a better one. By the time the Middle Ages deepened into superstition, the Colosseum had already worn more masks than any monument in history. It had been a theater of death, a noble fortress, a market, a home, and a barn. But now, something stranger began to happen. As the centuries turned and memory blurred into myth, the Colosseum became sacred not by decree, but by fear. People began to whisper that the ruin was haunted. They said ghosts still walked its corridors at night, gladiators who never stopped fighting, lions that still prowled the shadows, martyrs who refused to be forgotten. To some, it was cursed ground. To others, holy. Either way, no one saw it as ordinary anymore. Think about it. Hundreds of thousands of deaths had happened here. Every arch, every crack, every grain of dust was soaked with memory. The Colosseum wasn't just a ruin. It was a graveyard without tombstones. Christians, newly dominant in the city, began to see it through a different lens. They believed this was the place where early followers of Christ had been slaughtered for their faith. Whether that was historically true or not didn't matter. The story stuck. The amphitheater that once glorified pagan gods was rebranded as a shrine of Christian martyrdom. Pilgrims visited it not for entertainment, but for repentance. Pope saw an opportunity. If the Colosseum could no longer serve emperors, it could serve God. In a sense, that transformation saved it. Declaring the Colosseum sacred discouraged the worst looting. You don't steal from a church, or at least not as quickly. Some popes even ordered crosses erected within its ruins. But even as the Vatican blessed it, others kept mining it for marble and iron. The Colosseum had become a paradox, holy yet hollow, protected yet pillaged. On Sundays, priests led prayers amid the rubble. On Mondays, stonemasons pried out more blocks for new cathedrals. Only in Rome could faith and vandalism share the same altar. The common people believed the place was alive with spirits. Night watchmen refused to patrol near it. Travelers reported strange lights flickering among the arches, distant sounds of clashing metal, whispers that rose with the wind. Some claimed to see phantom crowds moving in the moonlight, as if the games had never truly ended. Even animals seemed to sense something. They said horses balked when passing by, and dogs howled at its gates. In a city already steeped in mystery, the Colosseum became its beating heart of unease. It was both relic and warning, a reminder that Rome's glory had come at a terrible cost. Yet even in this eerie reincarnation, the Colosseum continued to serve. It hosted small chapels, processions, and even hermits who lived in its upper arches. Believing the isolation brought them closer to God. Imagine kneeling to pray in a corridor that once ran with blood, whispering hymns where men once screamed for mercy. The duality of the Colosseum mirrored the duality of Rome itself. Spiritual rebirth, built atop centuries of sin. To walk its corridors in the 15th century was to stand between heaven and hell, between what humanity creates and what it cannot control. And maybe that's why the legend endured. The Colosseum didn't survive because it was strong. It survived because it kept changing. It absorbed each age like a mirror, reflecting whatever the people of Rome needed it to be: power, refuge, market, church. Even its ghosts adapted, turning from victims to saints, from warriors to warnings. By becoming haunted, the Colosseum found a strange kind of immortality. After all, nothing lasts forever, except a good ghost story. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the Colosseum had entered yet another life, one that no emperor, pope, or gladiator could have imagined. Nature had moved in. The ruin that once defined human dominance had been quietly conquered by silence, sunlight, and seeds. Grass crept through the cracks in the stone. Shrubs found footholds in fallen arches. Then came the trees, bold and uninvited, sprouting from the upper. Tears like green banners declaring that the empire of man was over and the empire of nature had begun. The same place where Rome once forced lions to fight now gave home to sparrows and vines. Life had returned to the stage of death. The irony couldn't be sharper. For centuries, the Colosseum had represented control, the triumph of human will over nature, of civilization over chaos. Yet here, in the quiet centuries after its fall, nature reclaimed it without fanfare. The earth doesn't seek revenge. It simply endures. Botanists in the Renaissance were astonished when they began to study the ruin. Within its stones grew more than 400 species of plants, some native, others foreign, carried in unknowingly by the empire's own ambition. Seeds trapped in the fur of lions brought from Africa, stuck in the feathers of exotic birds from Asia, or dropped in the waste of chained animals centuries before, had waited patiently for their moment. When the crowd vanished and the stones cracked open, those seeds took root. The Colosseum had become a greenhouse of history. To the people of the 15th century, this wasn't tragedy. It was wonder. Scholars came not to study architecture, but to catalog the plants. Some claimed to find herbs with medicinal power. Others swore the ruin held flora unseen anywhere else in Europe. Rome's greatest monument had turned into its strangest garden, a living museum where centuries overlapped. Each leaf was a survivor's tale. Each flower bloomed from ashes. And yet, even this rebirth was bittersweet. The same roots that made the Colosseum beautiful were also tearing it apart. Each vine that curled lovingly around an arch was, in truth, prying it further open. Nature wasn't rebuilding the amphitheater. It was finishing what earthquakes had started. The ruin's beauty came from its fragility. To look at it was to witness the slow, graceful collapse of empire, dressed in green. For Renaissance Rome, obsessed with rediscovering its past, the Colosseum became both inspiration and warning. Artists sketched its arches draped in ivy, poets wrote about its silence, and philosophers pointed to it as proof that time conquers all. Tourists began to arrive from distant lands, early pilgrims of curiosity, gazing in awe at the half-living monument. Some saw glory, others saw decay, but everyone felt small. The Colosseum was no longer Rome's pride or shame, it was its mirror. There's something hauntingly democratic about the way nature claimed it. Where emperors once sat above peasants, vines now grew without hierarchy. Sunlight touched every stone equally. Birds nested in the same crevices where nobles once placed marble statues. It was as if the world had restored balance in its own quiet way. The blood that once soaked the arena had nourished something gentler, something that didn't need an audience to exist. When travelers described the Colosseum in this era, they rarely mentioned gladiators. They spoke instead of color and stillness. The deep green against gray stone, the way the wind sighed through empty corridors, the way light shifted across the arches like time breathing. It was no longer a ruin of violence, it was a cathedral of endurance. Rome had fallen, empires had vanished, but the grass kept growing. And maybe that's the most human thing about the Colosseum story. Every civilization builds monuments to permanence, but in the end, the earth always reclaims its space. Not out of spite, but out of balance. The Colosseum's garden wasn't defiance, it was forgiveness. By the late Middle Ages, the Colosseum was no longer a monument that inspired awe or fear. It was simply there. A massive, cracked relic occupying the center of Rome like a scar that refused to fade. Nobody dreamed of restoring it. Nobody dared destroy it completely. It just existed, a landmark of contradiction, too sacred to touch, too ruined to save. For the average Roma, it was background noise, a part of daily life, like the hills or the river. But for travelers, it was a revelation. They would arrive expecting to find the symbol of empire's power and instead encounter its ghost. A ruin so grand that even half gone, it humbled every cathedral, palace, and pope around it. The locals didn't romanticize it. They lived around it, within it, and sometimes off it. Pieces of its stone-paved streets, built walls, and adorned fountains. To the medieval mind, reuse wasn't desecration, it was continuity. History wasn't preserved in glass cases. It was baked into the mortar of daily life. The Colosseum's missing half lived on all over the city, scattered like bones from a giant's grave. And somehow, that felt fitting. Rome itself had been broken and rebuilt so many times that this was just another chapter. By this point, the Colosseum's grandeur had turned into humility. Goats grazed where gladiators had bled. Merchants sold bread beneath arches that once echoed with imperial fanfare. The same arena that once hosted death for spectacle now hosted life in its most ordinary forms. People didn't come to cheer. They came to survive. In that sense, the Colosseum had finally become democratic. The blood of slaves and emperors had mixed into dust, and out of that dust, shepherds and shopkeepers built new lives. It wasn't the empire's amphitheater anymore. It was the people's ruin. What's remarkable is how quietly that transformation happened. There was no decree declaring the Colosseum a ruin, no official end to its story. It simply slipped out of history's spotlight, fading from necessity rather than neglect. Medieval chroniclers rarely mentioned it, except in passing as a convenient landmark or a quarry. It was as if Rome, embarrassed by its past, collectively decided not to look too closely. The Colosseum had gone from symbol of eternal empire to silent witness of impermanence. Yet that silence spoke volumes. The very fact that it was still standing partly, unevenly, defiantly, was a reminder that greatness can crumble and still command respect. Even in ruin, the Colosseum dwarfed everything around it. Pilgrims stood beneath its arches and saw both the glory and the warning of empire. Artists sketched it as a lesson in humility. Philosophers wrote of its beauty not as perfection, but as persistence. And in a strange way, its brokenness made it stronger. Whole buildings boast of power. Ruins whisper of survival. As the Renaissance approached, that whisper grew louder. Poets began to rediscover the Colosseum, calling it the theater of the world and Rome's eternal witness. They saw in its half-collapsed form something pure, a beauty untouched by vanity, a truth shaped by time. To them, the missing half wasn't absence, it was revelation. The ruin told a story no marble facade ever could, that even the mightiest empires end, but the echo of their ambition endures. And maybe that's why no one rebuilt it. To restore the Colosseum would have been to lie, to pretend that Rome's glory could be reclaimed. Instead, the city let it breathe, let it age, let it crumble gracefully. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Colosseum was allowed to just be. Not a stage, not a fortress, not a market, but a memory made solid. The Rome of the 5th century was a city of contrasts. New churches rising beside pagan ruins, papal power coexisting with ancient dust. The Colosseum, half devoured by time, stood at the heart of it all like a bridge between worlds. It had been born from ambition and preserved by indifference, and somehow that combination gave it immortality. Rome had stopped trying to own it, and in doing so, it finally began to understand it. By the dawn of the Renaissance, something began to stir in Rome, not just in its politics or its art, but in its memory. The world had started to look backward again, to rediscover what it had lost. And as artists, poets, and scholars resurrected the glory of antiquity, they turned their eyes to the Colosseum, the greatest corpse of them all. It stood at the center of the city like a wound that refused to heal, a half-vanished miracle that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Where medieval Romans had seen a convenient quarry, Renaissance thinkers saw a masterpiece of human will, a ruin that had outlasted kings, earthquakes, and indifference. Suddenly, the Colosseum wasn't just a leftover from a dead empire. It was proof that greatness could endure even after death. Travelers began to arrive from across Europe, their imaginations burning with classical fever. They stood in the shadow of the ruins, sketchbooks in hand, trying to capture what words could not. The scale, the silence, the gravity. Artists like Piranesi, centuries later, would turn it into an obsession, etching its arches as if trying to resurrect the soul of Rome through line and shadow. Poets called it the theater of time. Scholars wrote that even in ruin, it embodied divine geometry, human ambition measured against eternity. For the first time in centuries, the Colosseum was not a marketplace or a barn. It was an idea. The irony is that Rome didn't rebuild it. It couldn't. There wasn't enough marble left. And even if there had been, no one dared touch it. The missing half had scattered across the city, baked into the walls of palaces, churches, and fountains. St. Peter's Basilica gleamed with its marble. The Vatican courtyards were paved with its bones. To rebuild the Colosseum would have meant dismantling the city that had grown from it. And so Rome made a quiet compromise. Instead of resurrecting the Colosseum, it would remember it. Popes who once looted it now began to protect it. In the 18th century, Benedict XIV declared it a sacred site, consecrated to the memory of Christian martyrs, an official act that froze the ruin in time. Crosses were erected. Prayers replaced chisels. The Colosseum was no longer a quarry, but a relic of faith. Some saw that as redemption, others as irony. After all, the same church that had stripped its marble to build St. Peter's now proclaimed it holy. But maybe that contradiction is exactly what defines Rome. The ability to sin beautifully and repent just as magnificently. Over the centuries, archaeologists joined the poets and the pilgrims. They dug through the dust, uncovering chambers and tunnels that once pulsed with terror and applause. What they found wasn't just architecture, it was evidence of scale, of organization, of human obsession. They marveled at how Rome had built an entire ecosystem of spectacle beneath the sand. Elevators, cages, corridors for beasts and men. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was a philosophy, a system that turned chaos into theater, violence into order, mortality into entertainment. And yet, the ruin resisted being tamed. Even as scholars tried to define it, the Colosseum remained something more mysterious. It didn't just represent Rome's greatness, it exposed its guilt. The stones didn't glorify empire. They accused it. Every arch whispered of lives consumed, of power that mistook cruelty for culture. The Renaissance, for all its admiration, couldn't quite look the Colosseum in the eye. They saw beauty, yes, but beauty haunted by conscience. That duality has never left it. Tourists who stand there today still feel it. The awe and the unease, the fascination and the sorrow. The Colosseum is both monument and mirror. To gaze at it is to see our own world reflected back, our own obsession with spectacle, our hunger for stories built on suffering, our belief that grandeur excuses brutality. Maybe that's why it continues to matter. Because the Colosseum isn't just ancient history. It's a warning written in stone. And yet, despite everything, it endures. The ruin that was supposed to fall 1,000 years ago still stands. It has survived earthquakes, wars, and time itself. Not as a symbol of conquest, but as proof that nothing truly powerful ever belongs to one age alone. Rome didn't rebuild the Colosseum, but in a strange way, it became the Colosseum. Its stones live on in every corner of the city. Its shape in every amphitheater on earth. Its spirit in every civilization that dares to build as if it could defy decay. The Colosseum may be half missing, but that missing half isn't gone. It's simply everywhere. Stand before the Colosseum today, and you'll understand why no photograph, no postcard, no guided tour can ever quite capture it. You feel it before you understand it, will wait in the air. A silence so heavy it hums. The wind slips through its broken arches like the breath of ghosts. Half of it stands proud, half of it is gone, and yet somehow it feels complete. That's the paradox of the Colosseum. It was built to glorify eternity, and in its ruin, it finally achieved it. The missing half doesn't make it lesser, it makes it honest. You don't need to see perfection to feel permanence. Think of everything it has endured. The cheers of 50,000 Romans, the collapse of an empire, the tremors of the earth, the chisels of looters, the prayers of popes, and the indifference of centuries. Empires fell around it, Cities change their gods, their languages, their dreams, and still it remains sometimes whole, sometimes broken, always watching. It outlasted every ruler who swore his name would never be forgotten. The Colosseum didn't keep its promise to Rome. It kept Rome's promise to time. The irony, of course, is that what we see now, the ruin, the cracks, the missing half, is precisely what makes it eternal. Perfection fades quickly. Imperfection lingers. A flawless monument becomes a relic of its builders, but a broken one becomes everyone's. The Colosseum belongs to no emperor anymore. It belongs to humanity, to every person who has ever stood before it and felt that mixture of awe and melancholy, of pride and humility, of admiration and unease. It reminds us that even the mightiest things we build are temporary, but that the stories we carve into them can last forever. If you walk its corridors at dawn, when the tourists haven't yet filled the air with chatter, you can still sense the weight of all those centuries layered like dust. You can almost hear the echoes of steel on flesh, of prayers whispered in the dark, of merchants calling out in the medieval market, of goats bleeding on the grass, of hammers stealing iron, of vines breaking stone. Every sound the world forgot still lingers here, turned into silence. The Colosseum doesn't speak in words. It speaks in memory. And in that silence, it tells us something uncomfortable, yet beautiful. That destruction is not the opposite of creation. It's part of it. Every civilization believes it is eternal, that its monuments will defy time, that its power will be remembered in marble and light. Rome believed it. We believe it too. The one day, what we build will also break. The skyscrapers, the stadiums, the cathedrals, all of it will crack and fade. And maybe centuries from now, people will wander through our ruins and wonder what kind of stories we told ourselves. The Colosseum is proof that even when a civilization falls, what it leaves behind can still teach, still move, still breathe. That is the mercy of ruins. They outlive our arrogance. The Colosseum's missing half isn't a tragedy. It's a teacher. It reminds us that endurance doesn't always mean wholeness. Sometimes what survives is the echo, not the song. Sometimes what remains is enough. Rome's amphitheater may be half gone, but in its brokenness, it tells the full story, not just of conquest, but of consequence. It is the autobiography of civilization carved into stone, magnificent, brutal, fragile, and utterly human. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to it, not to mourn what's lost, but to understand what remains. Because in the end, the Colosseum is more than the story of Rome. It's the story of us. The desire to build, the hubris to believe it will last, the silence that follows when it doesn't, and the faint, enduring hope that even in ruin, there is meaning. So when you stand before the Colosseum, don't just look at the arches that still rise. Look at the spaces where stone has vanished. That's where the real history lies, not in what Rome built, but in what time allowed it to keep. Because time, unlike empire, never takes without giving something back. It gave the Colosseum its truth, that nothing perfect ever endures, but everything honest leaves an echo.